I was only 10 years old when I first realized I was an afterthought in my own family. While my parents packed their bags, smiling and laughing with my brother Omari, they told me I would have more fun with Grandma. I cry, but I didn't beg. I just stood there, wondering why love felt like a gift they gave to him, but never to me. What they didn't know was this: the girl they left behind would one day return, not as their burden, but as their boss. Layo was only a little girl when she began to notice how different her life was from her brother Omari's. Her parents adored him. They bought him new clothes, gave him toys, and took him on trips to the city and even to the seaside. Whenever people visited, they proudly spoke of Omari, calling him the joy of the family. But when it came to Layo, they never seemed to have the same excitement. Instead, they packed her small bag and sent her to live with Grandma Adisa in a mud brick house far away at the edge of the village. At first, Layo thought it was temporary, that maybe her parents would come for her soon. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into years. Each time she heard the sound of travelers passing by the house, she would run to the window, hoping it was her parents coming to take her home. They never did. Letters came sometimes, but they were filled with pictures of Omari smiling on vacations, standing in front of fancy cars, or holding gifts in his hand. Not once did the letters mention her. She felt invisible, like she was not part of the family at all. Nights were the hardest. She would sit by the small oil lamp, eating her meal of yam or porridge, and the silence would press on her. She imagined Omari laughing with her parents, eating rich meals, and sleeping in soft beds while she stayed in a room where the walls cracked and the wind slipped in. Sometimes she whispered to herself just to feel less lonely. She thought, why don't they love me the way they love him? Yet, even in the loneliness, there was someone who never let her feel completely abandoned. Grandma Adisa was old and had little, but what she had, she shared. She didn't have toys or grand meals to offer, but she gave Layo something far more precious: her time. She told her stories by the fire, stories of brave women and wise leaders who turned pain into strength. She listened when Layo spoke, even when it was only about small things like the goat running away, or how hard the walk to school was. It was in those quiet evenings, wrapped in the warmth of her grandmother's voice, that something began to grow in Layo. She realized that though she had been pushed aside, she was not worthless. Grandma's words made her believe that maybe being forgotten was not the end of her story. Deep inside her small chest, a tiny spark of resilience was planted, a seed that would one day grow into something her parents never imagined. Life with Grandma was not easy for Layo. Every morning before the sun rose, she carried a clay pot on her head and walked a long distance to fetch water from the stream. The pot was heavy, and sometimes it slipped, breaking on the ground, and she would have to go back again. After that, she helped Grandma with the goats, chasing them when they strayed into neighbors' farms. Her small hands grew rough from tying ropes, carrying firewood, and helping with chores that never seemed to end. School was far, and she had to walk barefoot on dusty paths, her feet often cut by stones or burned by the hot ground. While other children came with shoes and new books, Layo carried old exercise books tied with string. Some days she sat at the back of the class, her stomach empty, but her eyes still sharp with determination. She listened carefully to every lesson, telling herself that one day all this suffering would not be in vain. Meanwhile, her parents kept sending letters filled with pictures of Omari. In one photo, he stood smiling on a beach, the waves behind him. In another, he posed in a city, dressed in fine clothes, standing next to her parents who looked proud and happy. Layo stared at those pictures in silence, her heart heavy. She wondered why her parents never thought of sending her anything. No dress, no shoes, not even a note asking how she was. It felt as if she did not exist in their world at all. But Layo did not complain. She never spoke of her pain, not even to Grandma. Instead, she carried it inside, like a stone pressing on her chest. She told herself that crying would not change anything. If no one would choose her, then she would choose herself. Each time she fetched water, she whispered inside, "I will be strong." Each time she walked barefoot to school, she repeated to herself, "I will not give up." Her life in the shadows was shaping her in ways no one could see. While Omari was enjoying luxury, Layo was learning endurance. While her parents gave him everything easily, she was discovering the value of hard work. The world was teaching her harsh lessons, but In those lessons, she found something powerful, strength. Slowly, without even knowing it, she was building a spirit that could not be broken. The girl they forgot was becoming someone who would one day stand tall, and deep in her heart, the quiet vow she carried grew stronger. She would not wait for love or approval. She would create her own path, and no one would stop her. One night, after a long day of work, Leo sat outside with Grandma Adisa. The moon was bright, covering the whole village in soft light. The night was quiet, and the cool breeze carried the smell of firewood from nearby homes. Leo rested her head on Grandma's lap, her eyes full of questions she could not speak. She had been thinking about her parents again, wondering why they never wanted her beside them. It was as if they had pushed her away and forgotten she existed. Grandma looked at her for a long moment, then placed her wrinkled hand on Leo's shoulder. In her gentle voice, she said, "Child, the ones who bury you in the dirt forget that seeds grow there. One day you will stand taller than all of them." Leo sat still, trying to understand the words. But the way Grandma's eyes shone told her they were important. It felt like more than advice. It felt like a promise. Those words went deep into Leo's heart. That night she could not sleep. She kept hearing them again and again. The ones who bury you in the dirt forget that seeds grow there. She thought about how her parents had pushed her aside, how they had chosen Omari for every good thing, and how they had left her to struggle. Maybe they thought she would never become anything, but Grandma's words told her otherwise. She realized that being buried did not mean the end. It could mean a beginning. From then on, Leo's mind changed. She did not only work hard, she started working smarter. She asked more questions in school, stayed behind to read, and found ways to learn even when she lacked books. She learned to save small coins and plan how to use them wisely. She paid close attention to everything around her, always looking for lessons in simple things. Her classmates sometimes mocked her for her worn-out clothes or bare feet, but she did not let it break her. She remembered Grandma's words and held them close. Each insult felt like more dirt being thrown on her, but she told herself that the more they buried her, the stronger she would grow. Slowly, her teachers noticed her sharp mind. Even without support, she began excelling in her studies. Leo started to dream of a life beyond her small village, a life bigger than the pain of being forgotten. She imagined herself standing tall, not as the poor girl left behind, but as someone important. Grandma's prophecy had lit a fire inside her, and though she was still just a young girl, Leo already knew. One day, she would rise higher than anyone ever expected. Years passed, and Leo had grown into a young woman. She was no longer the little girl who cried in silence when her parents left her behind. She had built strength through every hardship, and she had learned how to survive without being chosen. But then one day, a message arrived. Her parents wanted her to come home. At first, her heart skipped with hope. She thought maybe they had finally remembered her. Maybe they wanted to see the daughter they had ignored for so long. But when she learned the real reason, her hope quickly faded. They only called her back because Grandma Adisa had fallen sick, and they knew Leo had been the one caring for her. Still, Leo packed her small bag and travelled back to her parents' house. The journey felt heavy, as though she was carrying not just clothes, but years of pain. When she stepped into the compound, the walls looked familiar, yet they did not feel like home. Her parents greeted her with smiles that seemed shallow, like smiles given to a visitor, not to a daughter. It felt like walking into a stranger's house. Omari was there too, taller now, dressed in fine clothes, his wrist flashing with a shiny watch. The moment he saw Leo, he laughed. "Listen to her," he said loudly, mocking her rural accent. "She sounds like the villagers who don't know anything." Her parents laughed softly at his words, brushing it off as a harmless joke. But to Leo, it cut deep. She had travelled miles to stand in front of them, and instead of warmth, she was greeted with humiliation. She looked at her parents, waiting for them to correct him, to tell him she was his sister and deserved respect. But they only exchanged looks and smiled weakly, as if his insult was something funny. Leo's heart sank. In that single moment, she realized the truth. Her parents hadn't missed her at all. She wasn't called back because they wanted her. She was called back only because circumstances forced it. That evening, as the family sat together, she noticed the difference in how they treated her compared to Omari. Her parents listened eagerly to his stories of the city, nodding proudly at every word. But when Leo tried to speak, They hardly paid attention. She felt invisible again, the same way she had felt as a child. Later that night, lying on the unfamiliar bed in the house that should have been hers too, she stared at the ceiling with tears in her eyes. The truth hit her harder than ever. She was still the outsider, even in her own family. Nothing had changed. If anything, the distance between her and her parents had grown wider. In that moment, Layo's heart hardened. She knew then that she could not depend on them for love or recognition. They had never truly wanted her, and she finally accepted it. The night of the family dinner was supposed to be a moment of togetherness, but for Layo, it turned into a wound she would never forget. The table was set with steaming dishes, the air filled with laughter, but none of it warmed her heart. Her parents sat proudly beside Omari, listening to him boast about his new friends in the city, his travels, and the respect he claimed to earn wherever he went. Every word he spoke seemed to make their eyes shine brighter, their smiles wider. They nodded and clapped as though he was the very pride of their lives. Then her mother lifted her cup and said with pride, "Omari, you are truly carrying this family's name with honor. You make us proud every single day." The words pierced Layo, not because she wanted her brother's glory, but because in all her years of struggle, she had never once heard such praise from them. She sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap, hoping maybe this time someone would remember her efforts, her sacrifices, her pain. Instead, her mother turned her eyes toward Layo and spoke with a smile that felt heavy with insult. "As for you, we only hope you at least marry well. That would bring respect to the family too." The words were soft, but they cut sharper than a knife. In that instant, Layo felt small, as though all she could ever offer them was her future husband's name. To them, she was not enough on her own. Her father chuckled and quickly shifted the conversation back to Omari, leaving her sitting in silence. Nobody noticed the tears threatening to fill her eyes. Nobody saw the storm building inside her. She forced herself to eat, though each bite felt bitter. That night, when everyone had gone to bed, Layo lay awake in her room, staring into the darkness. The words replayed in her head over and over, each time cutting deeper. She finally broke down, letting tears flow freely onto her pillow. She cried for the little girl who had been ignored, for the teenager mocked for her accent, and now for the young woman dismissed as someone who could only bring value through marriage. But as the tears slowed, something inside her shifted. She whispered to herself that this would be the last time she would cry for their approval. She understood now that she would never receive it. If she wanted dignity, she had to create it herself. That night, she swore an oath in her heart. She would build a life so powerful, so undeniable, that one day they would have no choice but to see her, not as an afterthought, but as someone greater than they ever imagined. When Layo returned to Grandma's house after the painful visit, her heart was heavy, but her spirit was burning with a new fire. She was tired of being invisible, tired of waiting for her parents to see her worth. She decided that if they would not give her value, she would create it for herself. Every insult, every moment of neglect turned into fuel inside her. She refused to stay broken. She started small. Each morning, she carried baskets of fruits to the market. The sun beat down on her, and her feet ached from walking long distances. But she never complained. She arranged her fruits neatly, calling out to customers with a smile, learning quickly how to convince people to buy. At the end of the day, she counted her coins carefully, no matter how little they were. Instead of spending them, she saved, determined to grow something bigger from her small beginnings. Soon, she saw an opportunity. Women in the market often admired colorful fabrics, the ones traders brought from faraway towns. Layo decided to try. She used her savings to buy a few pieces and sold them alongside her fruits. The fabrics caught attention, and slowly, more people began to come to her stall. She listened to what buyers wanted, remembered their preferences, and treated them with respect. Word began to spread that Layo was not only hard-working, but also sharp and trustworthy. As months turned into years, her little fruit stall transformed. She no longer carried only baskets of mangoes or oranges. Now she had bundles of fabrics stacked neatly, patterns so beautiful that women traveled from nearby villages just to buy from her. She learned how to bargain with suppliers, how to transport goods, and how to reinvest her profits instead of wasting them. Step by step, she turned struggle into success. People in the market began whispering about her. "That's Lio," they said, "the girl who started with nothing." Traders respected her, and customers trusted her. Even older business people were surprised at her wisdom and strength. Leo herself felt the change. She no longer walked with her head down. She carried herself with quiet confidence, knowing she was building a future that no one could take from her. She was no longer the forgotten child in her parents' shadow. She was creating her own name, her own story. Every coin she saved, every piece of fabric she sold, became proof that she was more than what her parents had thought of her. From the ashes of rejection, she was rising, step by step, trade by trade, into the woman she was meant to be. The morning was heavy with silence when Grandma took her last breath. The sun had not yet risen, and the world outside was still dark. But inside the small room, everything felt even darker. Lio sat by her bedside, her hand wrapped gently around Grandma's weak fingers. She had been there all night, whispering prayers, hoping for a miracle that never came. Grandma's breathing had grown shallow, and her voice had almost faded. Yet with her final strength, she turned her face toward Leo and spoke words that cut straight into her heart. "Don't cry, my boss. Lead your own life." The words were soft, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of love, wisdom, and sacrifice. Leo felt tears spill from her eyes as she bent over Grandma, holding her tighter, not wanting to let go. But slowly, Grandma's hand loosened, and silence filled the air. She was gone. For a moment, Lio felt the world collapse around her. This was the only person who had loved her without condition, the only one who had never mocked her or made her feel small. Losing her felt like losing her anchor, her shield, her home. But as much as it hurt, Grandma's last words echoed in her chest. "Don't cry, my boss. Lead your own life," they replayed again and again, like a voice guiding her, refusing to let her sink into despair. Lio wiped her tears and sat upright, her heart pounding with a new fire. She realized that Grandma had never wanted her to break. She had wanted her to shine. Crying would not honor her. Living fully would. Instead of folding into grief, Leo poured her pain into her work. She spent longer hours at the market, pushing herself harder, refusing to rest. Every fruit she sold, every fabric she traded, felt like a step toward proving Grandma right. When people asked how she managed to keep going, she smiled faintly and said, "For her." Days turned into months, and her small shop grew into something bigger. Customers noticed her determination, her discipline, her sharpness. They respected her not just as a trader, but as a leader in her own right. Each time she succeeded in a deal, she felt Grandma's spirit close, as if watching with pride. The emptiness in her heart was still there, but it was filled, little by little, with strength. Leo began to walk with her head higher than before. She was no longer the girl mocked by her family or pitied by neighbors. She was a woman shaping her own destiny. Grandma had left her with nothing but words, yet those words had become her greatest inheritance. She didn't crumble. She rose. Grief became her fuel, and in the silence of loss, she found her power. Grandma had slept, but Leo had awakened. Lio was no longer the quiet girl who used to hide her tears in the dark. By her mid-20s, her life had completely changed. She had worked day and night, saving every coin, taking every risk, and refusing to stop, no matter how hard it got. What began with selling fruits and fabrics grew into something much larger. She now owned warehouses where goods were stored, and she had many workers who looked up to her. Traders who once ignored her now came to her for deals. Even the men who used to laugh at her strength now respected her. She was bold enough to enter markets and routes that others were afraid to touch. Bandits, storms, and losses could not shake her spirit. She learned how to manage dangers and turn them into opportunities. When others gave up, Leo pushed forward. Soon, her trade lines stretched across towns, and her name spread beyond her village. People began to say that her caravans were safer than most, because where Leo led, things worked smoothly. Her childhood memories were still with her. The nights she went to bed hungry, the words her parents had thrown at her, the shame of being called the useless one. But she did not let those memories turn into bitterness. She wasn't building her empire just to prove them wrong. She was building it because she refused to remain small. She wanted a life of dignity, a life where her worth was not decided by anyone else. Her presence became magnetic. When she walked into a market, everyone noticed her, not because she shouted, but because she carried herself with calm strength. She looked people in the eye and spoke with confidence. She was no longer the girl who was told she had nothing to offer. She was a leader now, a woman who created her own path. Young girls pointed at her with admiration, whispering, "That's Leo. Look at what she has become." She bought clothes not to show off, but because she deserved comfort. She traveled not because she wanted others to envy her, but because she had built caravans of her own. The same bare feet that once walked dusty roads now stepped into towns with her workers following behind her, carrying goods that belonged to her. Every step she took was a reminder of how far she had come. People no longer called her Poor Leo. That name disappeared like smoke. Now she had a new title, Boss Leo. It wasn't just a nickname, it was respect. It was recognition. It was proof that a woman who refused to bow could rise higher than anyone ever imagined. And deep inside, Leo knew this was only the beginning of her story. Omari had grown up believing life would always bend for him. He wasted money on gambling, reckless friends, and empty luxuries. He never worked, never learned, never cared. Their parents fed his habits, believing he would one day be their pride. But years of arrogance and careless spending finally caught up with him. Debts piled high, businesses collapsed, and creditors came knocking at their gates. The fine house they once lived in was stripped bare, servants left, their land was sold, and neighbors who once praised them now whispered about their downfall. Leo heard of their troubles but stayed silent. She was not the weak girl they once dismissed. She had built herself from the ground, and every coin she owned carried sweat, patience, and sacrifice. While their name was fading into shame, hers was rising into greatness. She had offices, workers, caravans, an influence that spread across towns. People looked to her for opportunities. She had become the kind of woman her parents never believed she could be. It was only a matter of time before the door of her office opened and they walked in. They were not dressed in fine clothes anymore. Their pride had been washed away by hardship. Omari looked thinner, restless, and beaten by life. Their father's shoulders, once broad and commanding, now bent low with shame. Their mother's eyes, once filled with judgment, carried sorrow and regret. They stood before Leo like strangers in a world that no longer belonged to them. For a long moment, silence filled the room. The same daughter they had ignored and ridiculed now sat before them behind a grand desk, her presence commanding respect. Workers outside whispered, watching the scene. They all knew who these visitors were. Leo's parents, the same people who once threw her aside. Now they had come back, not to scold or dismiss her, but to beg. Her father cleared his throat, his voice trembling. He had never spoken to her like this before. His words broke the air like glass. "Boss, we didn't know you would become this." It was not just an apology. It was an admission that the tables had turned completely. The girl they once treated as worthless was now the woman holding power over their lives. Omari lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. The same brother who had been crowned as the golden child now stood stripped of everything, waiting for her mercy. In that moment, Leo did not gloat or rush to answer. She simply sat there, her silence heavier than any words. The world had changed. The poor girl they once ignored had risen so high that even those who once mocked her now had no choice but to bow. And everyone watching knew Leo had won. Leo looked at her parents, their faces filled with shame and regret. They were waiting for her anger, for her to throw their mistakes back at them. But she did not raise her voice. She did not speak with bitterness. Instead, she smiled softly, with a strength that came from all the pain she had endured and overcome. With steady eyes, she said, "I became this because you left me, and I thank you, because if you hadn't, I would still be begging for scraps instead of owning the table." Her words struck harder than any insult could. Her father lowered his gaze, unable to meet the eyes of the daughter he had abandoned. Her mother's lips trembled, but no excuses came out. And Omari, who had once looked at her with arrogance, now looked down at the floor, silent and broken. For the first time in their lives, they all realized the weight of what they had lost. In that quiet moment, Leo stood taller than ever. She was no longer the forgotten child left behind in her grandmother's house. She was no longer the girl who cried for their love or their approval. She was the woman who had built her own empire, the woman who had turned her loneliness into power. And now, she had nothing to prove to them. She turned away, her steps calm and strong, each one echoing with the choice she had made long ago, to live. For herself, not for the love that was denied to her. Her parents watched her go, but this time they did not see her as a burden or as a child. They saw her for what she had become. The room felt heavy with the truth. Omari's head remained bowed, the pride in him finally broken. Her father's whisper still hung in the air, but it was too late. And her mother, who once thought sending her away was nothing, now understood that decision had created the boss standing before them. Leo walked out of that office not with revenge in her heart, but with peace. She did not need their love anymore. She had chosen herself, and in choosing herself, she had won. The little girl who had been left behind had risen higher than they could ever imagine. She walked out, not as their forgotten child, but as Boss Leo, the woman who would never bow, not even to the family that once rejected her. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Hit subscribe and join our growing family of listeners who believe every forgotten child, every rejected wife, every underestimated soul deserves to rise. Drop a comment. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family and later proved them wrong? Your story might inspire someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, sometimes the people who leave you behind are the very reason you find the strength to move ahead. Because just like Leo, you too can turn pain into power. And one day, they'll call you boss.